I told you that all of this conversation and legislation against critical race theory had nothing to do with critical race theory. They wanted to stop the teaching of actual history in the United States of America. Now, the Senate in Texas, they have passed a bill to stop the teaching of civil rights. Yeah, that's what the Senate has done. Texas Senate bill passes to remove required lessons on civil rights movements from the public curriculum. Public schools in Texas are now one step closer to no longer being required to teach about various American civil rights movements in social studies classes. I told you this was the intent of all of this misdirection about critical race theory. Had nothing to do with an advanced theoretical framework formalized in the 1970s and was here well before that. Had nothing to do with it. It had everything to do with a false pretext of critical race theory to create a context to get rid of teaching true history in America. Now they're literally saying you cannot teach about Susan B. Anthony or Dr. King or any of them. You can't do it. Bloomberg reports that on Friday, the state Senate voted 18-4 to pass Senate Bill 3, which drops requirements for teachers to include lessons on Cesar Chavez, Susan B. Anthony, the history of Native Americans, the writings of Martin Luther King Jr. They got Dr. King in this foolishness and other figures. Let's put up some of the historical figures they would like us to erase from the memory of this country, people that stood up for others who were suffering. That's what this was about. This whole thing has been about getting them out of the curriculum. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, a Republican who presides over the Senate, said in a statement after the vote that Senate Bill 3 will make certain that critical race philosophies. What? Critical race philosophies? I've been a university professor for years. They've just made up something. So he's saying critical race philosophies, including the debunked 1619 founding myth, are removed from our school curriculum statewide. Once again, 1619, that project showed you how slaves, the enslaved, created the economic wealth and leverage that the United States currently still benefits from. That's what it did. It goes on to say, in fact, this bill on teacher curriculum is currently stalled in the Texas House of Representatives because House Democrats are in Washington, D.C. advocating on behalf of equitable voting rights. This is all in opposition to a voting bill that would place more restrictions on the state's already restrictive voting process. So look at how they're trying to hit you. Look at it now. This is a model that will be utilized across the United States of America. They don't want you picking the politician. They want politicians picking the voter. That's what they want to do. And so they're passing these extreme restriction policies so that they can pick who votes for them. And then they're going to pick people who count the votes. They're going to say, we want this particular person to count votes so that they can use the most restrictive policies possible to kick out votes. And they want to make sure that those who are coming up in K through 12 education do not learn the true history of this country, because those who are coming up, our young leadership class, those are the individuals who have an opportunity when they become of adult age, when they start getting into positions of authority to overturn the madness that these bigoted individuals created history long in the United States of America. And so they want to stop that, put the right politicians in place for their side only, for their agenda only, and at the same time, de-educating, miseducating young children, lying to them about the historical past of this very messy country. It goes deeper. Governor Abbott previously called for a special session so lawmakers could vote on these two pieces of legislation. And unless the Democrats return to Texas before the session expires August 6th, it looks like the bills will just keep on being stalled. Thankfully, Democrats left Texas so that Texas General Assembly could not have a quorum because of the insanity of the voting restriction bill. And because of that, they're not able to conduct regular business. And that's the reason why this is likely to stall. But that's it. That's the only reason. Kenya, what are your thoughts?
I think it's fascinating what we're even seeing here. If you take it a step further and just look at it solely at the educational level, we're watching the browning and blackening of this country. We're watching a country become more and more diverse. And what happens when you empower? What happens when a community, what happens when a country becomes more diverse? You demand agency and being represented within the country you live, within the community you live. And so this is all a part of a program where we're seeing similarly what we saw in Arizona, similarly what we saw in California. This isn't new. Yes, there's a nice, cool term that even folks are misusing now, what critical race theory or critical race philosophies, whatever now they want to call it. But essentially what we're seeing here is this is an effort to dial back the inclusion of people who will essentially make up the majority of this country over time, including them in the very history and recognition of the value of this country, the work in creating this country. And so what we're seeing is the same way that Chicano education was challenged in California, the same way that we saw Latino history being completely erased in Arizona. When you disempower a generation of children who go without seeing themselves represented in their history books, without seeing themselves represented in media, without seeing themselves represented in government, many of us in our generations have already seen and have already experienced the manifestations of that, the consequences of never being seen and being erased, essentially having your history, your prominence, and even your current influence in this country erased. When you disempower those generations at the early level, you keep them in a position of subservience. You keep them in that position of seeing as if their time, their existence, and their community in this country is on borrowed time, as if this country is never yours. That's the message it's sending across, and it's creating that generational impact, that generational messaging that many folks aren't paying attention to.
Very well said, very well said.